and he's going to talk about the dependence of arguments for scientific realism. Okay, thanks very much to the organisers of the conference. It's been a fantastic conference, really stimulating, and thanks so much for the invitation. Okay, so yes, in this this audience and this stage of the conference, I can be pretty brisk with the basics. So, scientific realism and epistemic stances. So, we can think of scientific realism as the view that unobservable scientific entities exist objectively and independently, and our best scientific theory is true or approximately true. Where anti-realism is the view that these entities don't exist, or more commonly, in recent years, that we should suspend judgment about whether they do. In the recent literature, as people have been talking about today, realism and anti-realism have been associated with epistemic stances, clusters of attitudes, goals, commitments, and values. These are not factual claims or beliefs, but can act as guides or policies or strategies in their formation and evaluation. Some of the beliefs traditionally associated with scientific realism may be truth acts, but they're typically generated partly as a result of the prior adoption of the realist epistemic stance. These stances are adopted largely as a result of one's values. Just a terminological point, I'm going to use the term realist stance rather than metaphysical stance, because I reserve the term metaphysical stance for something quite different that I'm not going to be talking about today. John says at some point that this is not just a terminological dispute, it's a substantive dispute. I'll explain why that's the case. I think it's just terminological, and realist stance is not unknown in the literature. So that's what I'm going to be using. So, realist and empiricism dispute can be thought of in terms of the conflicting aims of securing explanatory power and minimising epistemic risk. The realist thinks the benefits of explanatory power that come with committing to certain types of entity outweigh the epistemic risks associated with such commitment, given their distance from empirical evidence and their consequent lack of empirical vulnerability, as Unjust puts it. And the empiricist thinks the epistemic risks of such commitment outweigh whatever explanatory power may confer, and this is a conflict ultimately of values. And this is often associated with William James's famous point that when deciding what to believe, we have two aims: to believe the truth and to avoid error. And these aims can conflict. All we cared about was believing the truth. We'd go and be credulous and believe everything. We'd have lots of truth but lots of error. All we cared about was avoiding error. We believe nothing. We'd be great skeptics. And no error, but no truth either. We all pretty much value both of these things. We have to balance them off, trade them off against one another. It's common, and I've certainly done this, to run together the Jamesian point about truth with the point about explanatory power and minimising epistemic risk. But in a recent, really good paper that I reviewed for a journal, I don't know who the author was, but hopefully it will be published soon. The author argued for teasing apart these two criteria and defending the truth-based rather than the explanatory power, minimising epistemic risk based accounts of what characterises the stances. So that'll be interesting when that comes out, but typically these things tend to be kind of run together. So in my forthcoming book, I distinguish four stances, and this is clearly heavily influenced by John's work, particularly scientific ontology book. A lot of this is just footnotes to John's written. Perhaps we're all doing footnotes to Plato, but this is footnotes to John. Not that he necessarily agree with precisely the way that I put these things, but I find it useful to broadly distinguish between four stances. Firstly, what stances related to how far we should extend ontology. Well, there's a kind of a spectrum, so extending ontological beliefs to the observable only, because empiricism. The stronger and riskier stance extends ontology, ontological beliefs to the explicit but unobservable entities of science, such as electrons, protons, genes, and so on. I call that the standard scientific realist stance without any metaphysics of science. And drawing on again a distinction that Arndt makes in his book between the explicit entities of science, the entities that science sees it as its business to investigate, electrons, protons, genes, and so on, and the implicit entities of science, which are sort of mentioned in passing, or perhaps not even mentioned, but in some way implicated in scientific reasoning and scientific theories, laws, causation, natural kinds, properties, dispositions, modality, and so on. Call that the metaphysics of science stance. And then finally, the strongest and riskiest stance, which you might call the armchair metaphysics stance, which suggests that we extend ontology to non-scientific metaphysical entities, fixated fluidities, substances, platonic forms, grounding relations, truth makers, holomorphic compounds, monads, necessary beings, the absolute, and so on. Okay, now there are many things to say about this taxonomy. It's true, simplistic and crude as it is. I think I have about 9 clarificatory points in my book chapter on this. I'll just mention a couple. Firstly, it's a kind of spectrum or continuum, somewhat artificially packaged into 4 distinct stances, but there are clearly going to be borderline cases. Secondly, we can't characterize these stances purely in terms of subject matter or entities, because clearly things like laws, causation, properties, and modality can be theorized about in a fairly traditional armchair a priori way, or in a way that at least aspires to be much more naturalistic, employing what Arndt calls metaphysical inferences, which do involve a priori and explanatory elements, but where you start from the science, and science is the touchstone. So we have to bring in a kind of methodological criterion to distinguish between metaphysics of science and the armchair metaphysics stance. Another point of clarification is that the way I understand it is to adopt one of these stances involves adopting, well, you're committed to believe in certain types of entities if you adopt one of these stances. It doesn't mean you're compelled to. So if you adopt the standard scientific realist stance, you're committed to believe in things like electrons and protons. But whether you actually do depends on whether you think the first order arguments and evidence make such belief compelling. And I think in that respect, the localists are right that realism is really a matter of analysing on a case-by-case basis. Okay. So stance voluntarism, again, this has been covered in other talks, so I can be fairly brief. Voluntarism in epistemology generally is the view that the constraints of rationality are minimal and relatively easy to be satisfying. One is being rational so long as one is not being irrational. Where to be irrational is to violate the logical or probabilistic rules of consistency and coherence, or a more pragmatic constraint to sabotage or undermine oneself by one's own likes or standards. So on this view, rationality is about permission, not obligation. Rational beliefs or stances are permitted, not compelled beliefs or stances. So we have quite a low bar on stance counting as rational. Now, voluntarism in epistemology is traditionally associated with the stronger claim that many or all of our beliefs are under the direct control of the will. Something that seemed very plausible, at least with respect to a great many of our beliefs, which seem involuntary. But the form of voluntarism we're considering need not be committed to such a strong claim. One's voluntary choice of a stance might influence the types of beliefs that are options for one, but the beliefs one subsequently adopts can and should be adopted on standard evidential grounds. And this is nicely expressed in this quote from Eronen, where stances are second-order practical attitudes concerning the acquisition of first-order beliefs about the world. Even if first-order belief voluntarism is problematic, it's not entailed by second-order attitude voluntarism. The stance constitutes a framework within which beliefs can be assessed as correct, true, or rational. The arbitrariness of a stance or framework is not necessarily inherited by the beliefs resulting from inquiry within that stance or framework. Now, two caveats here. Bauman is actually characterising this view in order to attack it. I'm going to mention his criticisms of stance voluntarism a bit later. Secondly, while I think this is an generally accurate characterisation of the dealing question, I would object to the use of the term arbitrary. I don't regard the adoption of the stance or framework as arbitrary. That makes it sound like there's no grounds for it whatsoever. There are value-based grounds for adopting a stance, as we have been discussing. Okay. So, some terminology I introduced in my book that I found useful with respect to permissions and prohibitions here. So, let's say that a belief B is unpermissible, rationally permissible, for S if and only if B and the means by which it's justified is consistent with the rules of rationality. And then we have the corresponding clause for prohibition. A belief B is prohibited for S if and only if B and the means by which it's justified violate the rules of rationality. Secondly, a belief B is B permissible for S if and only if B and the means by which it's justified is consistent with the values and attitudes characteristic of the stance S accepts. You know, we have the corresponding clause for prohibition I don't need to read out. And then stance S, or one of a set of stances S plus, is a V requirement of view T if and only if T is ontologically committed to or entails the existence of an entity of which is B permissible according to S or S star. So this is meant to capture the sense in which, in one sense, for empiricists like Fraassen, for instance, it's not rationally prohibited from being a scientific realist. Scientific realism is not rationally prohibited on a voluntarist view. At least those beliefs are not prohibited. Qua beliefs in unobservable entities, and yet they violate the values and policies of the empiricist stance. So, for the empiricists who said such beliefs are permissible, not are prohibited, but are being prohibited, not being permissible. For the realist, beliefs in unobservable entities of science are both are permissible and being permissible. So the thought here is the kind of a two-level picture. If one adopts the realist stance, a certain type of belief will be being permissible. Carves out a space for types of belief. Right. And then you can go on to consider the arguments and evidence for believing in certain entities at that time. And that's where arguments and evidence play a role, but downstream from stance choice. But if one doesn't adopt the realist stance, if one is an empiricist in certain types of belief, or maybe being permissible are not permissible for you, then the question of arguments and evidence just doesn't come into it. It's not even relevant. Okay. So that's the basic picture, and it follows that arguments for realism about certain entities will presuppose acceptance of the realist stance. Now, is this irrational? Well, some people think so. So, in a recent paper, Pincock suggests that the realist, at least, should not accept voluntarism about her realist stance. He's happy to accept, yeah, there are these stances, they're important, but wants to reject stance voluntarism. He argues that if the realist holds that there are not theoretical grounds but only pragmatic ground for accepting the realist stance. She has to accept that her realist commitments are not rationally compelling, but rather entirely optional and ultimately arbitrary. Her belief in, say, unobservable entities like electrons is voluntarily chosen and thus doesn't amount to knowledge on the voluntarist view. It's only rational to believe that entities exist or fail to exist or to remain agnostic on the basis of the evidence. Thus, if we decline to believe in a certain type of entity because such belief is being prohibited by our stance, then the latter is accepted for non-evidential reasons and we're being irrational. And Bauman offers a similar arguing that it's irrational to adopt an epistemic stance, which after all is supposed to be a stance that's useful for epistemic inquiry, a stance that is truth inducing. It's irrational to adopt such a stance when one recognises that one does not do so for epistemic reasons. Okay? And he thinks that voluntarist position is you don't adopt an epistemic stance for epistemic reasons. You adopt it based on your values or whatever. Which I think is not the right way to think about it. These sorts of objections, I think, overlook the fact that the very idea of believing in certain types of entity on the basis of certain types of evidence or forms of argument only makes sense against the background of the adoption of a stance or framework. The question of whether the evidence supports belief in, say, electrons only arises once we've already adopted a stance according to which it's epistemically legitimate to infer from certain sorts of scientific evidence to belief in explicit but unobservable scientific entities. So it's misleading to present the grounds of scientific ontology as being a matter of evidence or stance choice. Rather, questions of evidence only come into play given the prior adoption of a particular stance. Evidential considerations are important, but they're downstream from stance choice. From this view, the position of one who declines to believe in electrons on the basis of the V prohibitions of the empiricist stance is not, I reject belief in electrons since such a belief is prohibited by my stance, irrespective of the evidence. That sounds irrational. It is rather, I don't endorse the stance according to which the question of whether the evidence supports belief in electrons is even a legitimate question. Right, so it's perfectly consistent, voluntarist claims, for S to freely adopt a stance based on S's values, but then once the standards of evidence and form of argumentation licensed by that stance are in play for S, to regard certain beliefs of the output of these as rationally compelling for S. It's part of what one commits to when one accepts a stance is precisely to regard beliefs that are generated on the basis, forms of argument and standards of evidence permitted or encouraged by that stance as potentially epistemically rationally justified and as potential items of knowledge. Epistemic stances are above all policies for knowledge generation. On this view, reflecting that one's choice of stance was optional in the relevant sense, need not undermine one's confidence in beliefs formed on the basis of the commitments of the stance. If this is right, all arguments for scientific realism as a thesis, or particular forms of scientific realism as theses are stance dependent. But for many, this just can't be right. They hanker after stance independent argument for scientific realism. So I'll give a couple of examples. Eronen argues in his defense of robust entity realism for the life sciences that when we have multiple independent lines of evidence in support of the reality of some unobservable entity in science, this example is endocrine cells and the retina, it quote borders on irrationality for anybody, whatever their general commitments, to withhold assent from believing in it, even if such withholding is technically permissible on the empiricist voluntarist position. But this again overlooks the fact that questions of evidence are downstream from stance choice. If we've adopted the realist stance with its characteristic B permissions, we may apply Eronen's criteria and consider evidence such as he presents for the reality of unobservable entities, and the evidence may be compelling for us. But according to the voluntarist, it's not irrational to adopt the empiricist stance on which such beliefs be prohibited, such that the question with evidence just can't get a look in. And to declare such a position irrational, as Eronen does, really begs the question against it. Moreover, Eronen also begs the question against the empiricist in that the type of argument he recommends for justifying realism about certain entities is a species of inference to the best explanation, as he admits, albeit a local one. An argument form that is internal to and presupposes the realist. So something else that's been discussed extensively at the conference is naturalistic localism or particularism, on which the local first order scientific evidence for the existence of certain entities of science, the evidence adduced by scientists themselves and forming the basis, their ontological commitment is sufficient evidence for the realist philosopher to commit to them. And that's all we need. Particularly philosophical arguments or principles, arguments such as the no miracles arguments are unnecessary. To the extent that Heron's celebrated experiments conclusively established the satisfaction of the scientific community, the reality of atoms, and the truth of the atomic hypothesis, philosophers should believe that atoms exist and atomic theory is true. Philosophy has little to add to this. So, as opposed to, be a stance independent realist theory, I think. But I think it will be a mistake to suppose that the localist view amounts to nothing more than, as it were, repeating what scientists already believe and observe. No philosophical position or epistemic stance is involved. And Aronhart and Arroyo in the 2021 paper make this mistake, we're not alone, in suggesting that the localist view, what they call full-blooded naturalism, eschews metaphysics entirely. It's a non-metaphysical view in the realist debate, according to many. To the extent that the view is a version of scientific realism, though, recommending that we commit to the reality of unobservable scientific entities, it is an instance of the realist stance, and therefore presumably it is underlain by the values characteristic of that stance. As Fraassen taught us, given the coherence and availability of the empiricist alternative, any view that involves realist commitment is thereby metaphysically committed, whether its proponents like it or not. And after all, the only grounds for believing in the existence of many of the unobservable entities embraced by the localist is their ability to explain the relevant observable phenomena. So it's hard to see how such a view could fail to be underwritten by an epistemic stance, among whose central components is that it affords high value to explanatory power in matters of ontology. Moreover, Fitzpatrick argues in a paper which in a lot of ways is sympathetic to localism, but argues convincingly that localism can't just be a matter of reciting first order evidence, and there's no philosophy involved. So he points out that in making the case for localism, Achenstein in fact helps himself to certain philosophical assumptions and arguments that ought to be illicit on the localist view. So he offers general philosophical accounts of the relation between theory and evidence. General accounts of the relation between theory and evidence are not part of science. It's part of philosophy. It takes time to rebut anti-realist philosophical arguments. It's not part of science to rebut anti-realist philosophical arguments. So philosophy always seems to be involved here. There's also the problem of the metaphysical interpretation of first order scientific claims and theories. And that interpretation is underdetermined by science, right? So it's one thing to say, oh, Perrin established that atoms exist, atomic theory is true, so that's the end of the matter, we commit to atoms. Well, fine, but what are atoms? I mean, there are respectable alternatives, as we all know. The flat-footed realism about atoms or atomic particles understood as tiny objects with intrinsic properties distinct from other entities and persisting over time. So according to structural realism, of course, there are no entities, things, base level of reality. This is the lesson of quantum mechanics, they argue. I've recently been reading Helgeland, which I'm not a physicist, but a popular work by Carlo Rovelli, outlining his interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is the latest interpretation of quantum mechanics that's being taken seriously and discussed by physicists and philosophers of physics. On his view, there are no stable entities at all. As an interpretation of quantum mechanics, but also a whole of reality. There aren't even any intrinsic properties. Every property is had in relation to some other, in relation to something else. On his relational interpretation of quantum mechanics, which he explicitly connects with structural realism by precursors for it, actually in ancient Buddhist thought. He's a physicist, but also extremely philosophically literate one. And he's giving a scientific philosophical interpretation of quantum mechanics that is quite serious and doesn't involve things or stable entities and so on. So the lesson is that judging what ontology is dictated by our best current science, even something like atomic theory, is a philosophical activity. Okay. So the time I've got left, I want to offer a couple of examples of the stance dependence of scientific ontology from my forthcoming book, Empiricism, Naturalism, and Metaphysics of Biology. Give a bunch of examples. I'll just pick a couple for today. So I have to be fairly brief. Get hold of the book for the more detailed story. I'm going to talk about realism about species and realism about teleology. Now, these, unlike some of the other arguments we've looked at, are not explicitly put forward as stance-independent claims or views. But certainly the arguments that are offered or presented are presented as if they're just a matter of argument and evidence. So their stance dependence is not acknowledged. I want to bring it out. So there are some classic arguments for realism about species, including Quinian indispensability arguments employing his criterion of ontological commitment. Some biological theories and explanations indispensably quantify over species, but given the Quinian criterion of ontological commitment, we can believe that species exist. There's anthropological evidence that seems to show that many different kinds of human societies and cultures identify the same species taxa in nature, best explanation of which is perhaps that species exist. And thirdly, species realism has been said to follow from or be strongly supported by certain well-established macroevolutionary theses in biology, such as punctuated equilibrium. Now, whatever the merits of these various arguments for species and higher taxa realism, the key point for us is that unless one has adopted the realist stance, one has no reason to consider such arguments, as they presuppose that belief in the reality of species is B permissible. If ontologically committing to species is B permissible for one's adopted the realist stance, one may, should one be convinced by the relevant arguments about species realism, one may adopt species realism as explanatory of biological and perhaps folk practice. But is this correct? It might be wondered why I'm claiming that certain arguments for certain types of realism are only available to those who've adopted the realist stance. Why can't anybody, whatever stance they've adopted, or if they've adopted no stance, accept the Quinian criterion of ontological commitment, then proceed to consider whether it applies to species? Why can't anybody, whatever stance they've adopted, or if they've adopted no stance, accept the theory of punctuated equilibrium, an acceptance which itself is surely not realist stance dependent, and accept that the theory strongly entails or supports species realism? Even if we can see that one has accepted species realism, to that extent one has adopted or should adopt the realist stance, at least implicitly, why cannot the adoption of the stance be the consequence, as it were, not a precondition of considering and accepting as compelling these sorts of arguments? Well, my reply is that the realist stance, with its commitment to the value of explanatory power, is always lurking in the background of these sorts of arguments. So on closer inspection, the arguments will only be regarded as compelling if the stance has already been adopted, at least implicitly. And so the empiricist of the Fraassen variety can accept Quine's criterion of ontological commitment, but withhold assent in the empiricist fashion from the truth of claims referring to species. Just as the empiricist can withhold assent from, suspend judgment about, the truth of claims referring to electrons. And the reason she withholds assent from these claims is precisely that she rejects the value of the realist stance places on the putative explanatory power that commitment to these unobservable entities potentially brings. And so the Quinean argument for species realism will only be compelling to one who's already adopted the realist stance. Or consider the inference from punctuated equilibrium. But here's a quote from Stephen Jay Gould: if population A changes so extensively by anagenesis that we feel impelled to provide the resulting population with a new Linnaean name as species B, then where should we place the breakpoints between A and B? Any boundary must be arbitrary. Punctuated equilibrium took a radically different approach. Eldridge and I argue that the vast majority of species originate by splitting, and the standard tempo of speciation when expressed in geological time features origin in a geological moment followed by long persistence and stasis. Thus, the classic and endlessly threading species problem in paleontology disappears because species act as well-defined Darwinian individuals, not as arbitrary subdivisions of a continuum. So it's supposed to remove much of the arbitrariness involved in delineating species. Now, the truth of punctuated equilibrium may remove some, though not, as Gould admits, all of the fuzziness of species boundaries, but it doesn't force us to be species realist. There's a gap between the claims of punctuated equilibrium and species realism, and this gap can seemingly only be filled by presupposing the realist stance. I'm inclined to accept the realist stance, inclined to accept into one's ontology entities like species as explanatory posits, then the inference from punctuated equilibrium to species realism can seem compelling. To put it another way, if one is antecedently inclined to accept species realism, one can find in punctuated equilibrium a picture or model of species, their agency and boundaries that buttresses that view. But if one's not so inclined, then not required. Okay, and my final example is teleology in biology. Final example of a scientific realism pursuit in the philosophy of biology. So, standard view, some of you may know, of biological teleology combines realism and reductionism. Functions are objective features of the natural world. But teleology is reducible to non-teleology via something like the selected effects account of biological functions. It's reducible, but it's supposed to be realist, just like reducing water to H2O didn't show that water doesn't exist. Reducing heat to molecular motion didn't show that heat doesn't exist. Well, reducing biological functions, teleological functions, to facts about history, fitness, and selection also doesn't show that teleology doesn't exist. But in recent years, some have advocated a return to a stronger Aristotelian account of biological functions, on which teleology is a fundamental feature of the work. Well, maybe not of the cosmos. There's not a return to an Aristotelian physics or teleological account of everything in reality. This is about, in particular, the purposes and functions of organisms understood as agents. But such teleology is irreducible, not reducible to fitness, selection, and history. So, in Walsh's 2015 book, Organisms, Agency, and Evolution, he argues the activities of especially organisms are explained in terms of their purposes and ends, and such explanations are not replaceable without loss by non-teleological explanations. The thought here is to understand the Aristotelian position, not in terms of backwards causation. So if Aristotle or strong teleology is understood as saying that future events somehow cause past events, that is unintelligible. But it's not obvious that it's unintelligible to explain present events in terms of future events. Explain activities and features of organisms in terms of the goals and ends and purposes of organisms. Now, in my terms, belief in strong teleology in biology B requires at least a fairly strong version of the metaphysics of science stance. I think of teleology as a kind of implicit feature of science. Possibly even the armchair metaphysics stance, and there's a dispute about this. There will be more moderate realists, those who defend the reductionist account, and find this kind of strong teleology, beyond the pale metaphysically, taking us into the metaphysical abyss. Right, so that's a dispute. But what's interesting is that although Walsh doesn't talk in terms of stances, he makes the telling point that the strong teleology view he favours is only an option for those who are not, quote, metaphysically squeamish. And he says explicitly in his book, here's the standard reductionist view, but for those who are not metaphysically squeamish, here's this alternative, stronger Aristotelian account. Now, metaphysical squeamishness, or the lack of it, is a paradigmatically stance-dependent element or value, or whatever you want to call it. It's kind of physiological, intellectual reaction, perhaps. I'm not sure. And stances can almost be defined in terms of their degree of metaphysical squeamishness. As we move along from our weaker to our stronger stances, from the empiricists to the standard scientific realist and the metaphysics of science stance, the armchair metaphysics stance, metaphysical squeamishness diminishes. So if you adopt a stance that involves a significant degree of metaphysical squeamishness, strong teleology is not an option for you. Okay, and arguments such as those Walsh offers need not be considered. But if you adopt a stance that involves no or minimal metaphysical squeamishness, then strong teleology is an option for you. Of course, it doesn't mean if you adopt that stance, one of those stances, that you must adopt strong teleology. You have to look at the arguments and evidence. Rather, you're permitted to. The arguments and evidence are thought compelling. But, and this is really the point, if there are no rational, objective, stance-independent reasons to not be metaphysically squeamish, which seems clear to me there are not, then there's no rational compulsion for realism about strong teleology to be an option for you, and no reason to consider that. So again, arguments for types of scientific realism, in this case realism about strong, irreducible teleology in biology, are stance-dependent. Okay, so the final point, I've talked about how arguments for particular realist theses are dependent on adoption of the realist stance. But my view has the odd implication that arguments for versions of scientific anti-realism, some anyway, may also presuppose the realist stance. Why? Well, because if they assume that the specific realist thesis in question is on the table as a genuine option, even if it's ultimately rejected, then they presuppose the realist stance, right? So for arguments to be relevant, for arguments to even kick in, the relevant entities have to be admissible. We have to be working within the realist stance. Okay. For one who rejects the realist stance, doesn't have to be a realist. After all, one who accepts the realist stance, as we've already seen, doesn't have to be a realist about every entity, belief in which is permitted by the stance. On the realist stance, beliefs in unobservable entities are being permitted, way beliefs in unobservable entities. But once we're in that stance, as I said before, the realist can consider the first order evidence and consider the local philosophical relevant arguments for believing in certain types of entities. The realist might think the evidence supports the existence of quarks but not dark matter, species but not higher taxa, and so on. It will depend on the first order evidence. And also, if you think of the metaphysics of science stance that permits belief in the implicit entities of science, there will be, in that case, not scientific first order evidence, but philosophical arguments. And they may convince you to believe in natural kinds, but not dispositions. Some, but not other implicit entities of science. For those who reject the realist stance, such realist theses are not even live options, there are arguments against them are beside the point. Okay? So that's why, paradoxically, even arguments for scientific anti-realism, arguments for scientific anti-realism may presuppose the realist stance. Okay, so in conclusion, I've considered several recent arguments for versions of scientific realism, both more traditional forms and specific realist theses in biology. Arguments that are explicitly or implicitly claimed to be stance independent, rationally compelling for anyone, whatever their prior philosophical commitments. I've argued that all these attempts fail, that these arguments presuppose the realist stance, So I'm going to conclude that all arguments for scientific realism presuppose the realist stance. Now, this is considered a questionable induction from a few examples. I would say that, as I tried to explain, there are theoretical grounds for this conclusion as well. Right? It's not surprising these arguments presuppose a realist stance. Since the very activity of arguing for forms of scientific realism only makes sense against the background of the acceptance of values, goals, and commitments characteristic of a particular stance. This stance is optional, but not rationally mandated on the voluntarist view. And that's important. That's kind of what makes the claim interesting, right? So as I pointed out, Peacock accepts the stance dependence of the arguments, but thinks a stance, like a realist stance, can be rationally mandated. That kind of makes the stance view trivial. For it to be an interesting claim, you have to have this voluntarist component where the realist stance is optional but not rationally mandated, like other stances such as the empiricism stance. That's it. Thank you.